Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Miles. I use they, them pronouns, and I like to talk about books. If you are a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate you. So today I am doing something kind of new for my channel. I have mentioned my interest and my love for folklore many times, and I am studying it in school. I'm an English major and I'm creating my own concentration in folklore, so I like to consider myself an amateur folklorist. I have spent a lot of time working with this material and I really love folklore. So throughout this video, I am going to be talking about what is folklore, why I study folklore, why I personally study folklore. You're gonna hear the word folklore so many times throughout this, so I apologize in advance. And then I am also going to give you some resources on Appalachian folklore, which is one of my main areas of study, and then also how to find folklore for your own region. And excuse me if I am looking at my notes a lot. This was a big video to plan and a really fun video. I'm just so excited. I'm glad so many of y'all wanted to hear about this, and so yeah. Let's just get right into the video. I wanted to start with a definition of folklore, a general definition. And this is from the website whatisfolklore.org. They say, folklore is our cultural DNA. It includes the art, stories, knowledge, and practices of a people. While folklore can be bound up in memory and histories, folklore is also tied to vibrant living traditions and creative expression today. So, folklore is a living thing. A lot of people, especially in the United States, see folklore just as silly superstitions or a thing of the past, but it is everywhere. It is so alive and well in our current culture and in so many other cultures. And then that kind of brings us, I also wanted to say I am going to be talking about folklore and fairy tales as kind of the same thing. Fairy tales stem from folklore, and they didn't really become fairy tales until they were collected and marketed as fairy tales, but before that they were all folklore. Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood all came from folk tales. So folklore, fairy tales are kind of on the same level to me. Fairy tales obviously are just the ones that we know as fairy tales. So why study folklore? Why do I study folklore? Why do I love it so much? Folklore is a form of history. It is a form of cultural anthropology. You can tell so much about people or cultures from their folklore. For me, studying folk and fairy tales allows me to reignite my sense of childlike wonder. It ties me to the past. It lets me understand where we came from, especially if you're studying regional folklore like me. I live in North Carolina and I study mostly Appalachian folklore. It allows me to connect with the place that I live and feel connected to the people that came before me and that lived here before I did. I also wrote that to me, folklore is time travel. It's the reminder that everything and nothing has changed. It's proof that a simpler life did and can exist, that this wonder and community that grew folklore can exist again. So that's kind of why folklore, that's what and why folklore. Now I wanted to talk about my personal experience with folklore and what my interest in folklore is, because I posted on my Instagram before filming this and asking for specific questions that people had, and one of the most asked things was, what was the first folktale that really stuck with you, and why are you interested in folklore? I hadn't really realized until I was writing this video just how folklore has been integrated into my life for so long. When I was a kid, I had this set of DVDs called Britannica's Fairy Tales from Around the World, and it had your classic Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, The Little Mermaid, Hansel and Gretel, and wrapped it all up into these DVD sets, and then also told different versions of them from around the world. And Hansel and Gretel was always my favorite, I remember. I've always had a thing for scary witches. I just love them. When I was a kid, I loved anything scary, and I loved scary stories, and I loved the scariest folktales that I could find, the ones that were right on the border of being too inappropriate for children. I also remember loving this HBO series as a child called Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child, and that was wonderful. That I can really look back and be like, that is where my interest in like world folklore started, because it was like created around diversity. Like one week you would have a fairy tale from China, one week you would have one from Africa, one week you would have an Italian one, an American one, and often they would be the same form of fairy tale. And I always thought that was so interesting. So like you would get a Sleeping Beauty style story from America, from Europe, from Africa, and I always thought that was so interesting how the same kind of story could exist through so many cultures. I feel very lucky that I got to grow up with these really culturally diverse fairy tales. I have such strong memories of all of them. And as I got older, I became obsessed with monsters and like vampires and werewolves and cryptids, and those are all forms of folklore too. I would go to the library and just check out as many books as I could on these subjects. I remember going to the Scholastic Book Fair and buying books on ghosts and vampires and monsters and all of that stuff, and I didn't really see that as folklore at all at the time. I didn't really see any of this as folklore at the time, but it totally was. I was really into urban legends at that age too. I would read a lot of American and Japanese urban legends specifically because those were the scariest. The one that always sticks out to me the most was, what is it called? Oh, it's in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, but you can see this story many, many places. And it's called High Beams and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And oh my God, it's so scary. I think about it when I'm driving like all the time. It's when this girl is driving home and it's in the middle of the night, and this car behind her is flashing its high beams at her constantly, and she's getting really, really freaked out. And she thinks this guy's following her. She's wondering what's going on. She doesn't want to pull over because she's scared that he could hurt her. And she gets home and the guy is still following her, and she runs inside as fast as she can. The guy comes to the door and he's like, wait, I'm not going to hurt you. There's somebody in your back seat. And every time he reached up with his knife, I flashed my high beams at you, and he would go back down. And that scared me so much when I was a child. And then as I hit like middle and high school, mostly middle school, I grew up with the internet. So I got really, really into creepypastas, which if you know, you know. And looking back on it, they are a form of modern folklore. It's these stories that get copy and pasted on Reddit forums, originally 4chan forums, and each time someone posts it, they change a little bit. And you know, our definition of creepypasta has definitely changed throughout the years. Now it's just an online scary story, but that's the internet's version of urban legends. So you can see through all of these ages, from I was a baby watching these fairy tales, when I was in elementary school checking out as many books as I could on cryptids and vampires and werewolves, and then when I was in middle school and I was reading all of these creepypastas. Like, looking at all of this together, really, it makes sense how I ended up where I am. And then I started college. I moved from Florida to North Carolina in like 2018, a couple years before I started college. And I became really, really interested in Appalachian folklore and witches specifically. And that kind of brings us to my interest in folklore and like my personal interests and my recommendations for you. So my specific interests with folklore are Appalachian witchcraft, disability and disfigurement in folklore because it is very, very prevalent, and craft. So I'm a weaver. I work on my school's fiber arts crew, so I have learned how to weave and do lots of traditional crafts. So I am super interested in the way that shows up in folk and fairy tales as well. So I thought I would take you through some of my folklore book collection. This is not all of it, but I thought it would be fun to kind of talk to you about some things. So these are just a few selections too. Not all of it is Appalachian folklore. I'm also going to tell you about a few things that I don't have with me right now. if you want a more in-depth folklore collection video, let me know, because I would love to do that. I just don't know if there's any interest in it. My full collection is probably like 2 times the amount of what I have here. But I wanted to start off with these small independent British collections. These are like little magazines that come out seasonally. This one is Hellboard. This is the Yuletide special. You might remember I hauled this in my Christmas book haul, but these are beautifully laid out and just go into British folklore mostly. And this one is Weird Walk. This is the Samhain 2021 edition, and also just laid out beautifully. This article is about the history of folk horror. These are really cool. I would really recommend checking these out if you are interested in English folklore, because those are wonderful. They're very aesthetically pleasing. This is Appalachian folklore. This is Mountain Ghost Stories and Curious Tales of Western North Carolina. I love this little book. I have only read a few of the stories so far, but I have been really enjoying it. And this is definitely more of ghost stories, campfire stories kind of book. Next, I have the Virago Book of Witches, which is what I really used when I was first getting interested in witches. I had an independent study, not last semester, but the one before, about witches and folklore, and I used this to kind of understand the general ideas around witches and the folklore around witches and the archetypes. And that's what also really got me interested in disability and craft, because those are 2 things that I'm really interested in, and I didn't realize how much they intersected with folklore. If you think about your stereotypical vision of a witch, she's usually disfigured. She is usually an ugly old crone living alone in the woods. And I think that our societal perceptions of disability over time have really influenced our folklore, especially around witches. So I really liked this book, would definitely recommend. This is something I'm currently using for my Appalachian folklore studies. I'm actually currently writing an abstract that will hopefully get accepted to present at a witch conference about the Southern and Appalachian relationship with witches, which is super cool and really, really complicated. When a lot of people think of American witchcraft, they think of the Salem witch trials and the puritanical relationship with witches, but Appalachia and early Appalachian settlements had an extremely different relationship with witches. There were multiple different kinds of witches, and there were still definitely examples of people being accused of witchcraft and of dark magic, but these communities were super, super self-reliant, independent in the mountains, very cut off from the rest of the world. There weren't, there weren't general stores in these places, and there weren't doctors. And so these communities really, really relied on granny women and herb doctors, or colloquially they were called yarb doctors, and witch doctors. And so witch wasn't always a bad word in Appalachia as it was in puritanical societies. So I'm writing about that right now, and then also how disability and craft plays into it. So I've been doing a lot of research on Southern witch tales. I'm currently reading Witches, Ghosts, and Signs by Patrick W. Gaynor, Folklore of the Southern Appalachians. This is mostly in Virginia, but very interesting stuff. This is a just basic, this is Grandfather Tales by Richard Chase. He collected them. And this is a sequel to the Jack Tales, which you might, it's like Jack and the Beanstalk and those kind of stories. These are just kind of like Southern folk and fairy tales. So I haven't read that one yet, but I did get it. This is Morphology of the Folk Tale by V. Prop. Have not read this, have been meaning to forever, but I'm really, really interested in it, and it's about how folklore changes over time and over different regions. I also wanted to mention, I don't have this with me, it's a gigantic 3-volume collection of the ATU folktale index, and it's mainly Eurocentric, so keep that in mind, but it has assigned different tale types to each fairy tale. And so like stories that have like a Sleeping Beauty aspect, that's a certain tale type, that have like that same story beat. Snow White tale type, there's a Cinderella tale type where it's like this young girl is you know, her mother dies, her father remarries, you have the evil stepsisters, you have this rags to riches story. You see that in so many folktales, and the ATU index kind of helps you identify that. So let's say you're really interested in this Cinderella story format and you want to see what the Italian version of that is and what the I don't know, other versions of it, so you can look up the ATU tale type and find more, if that makes sense. And that's just a huge volume. I got those through my school library. They're not very accessible. I wrote down, there is the Folklore and Fiction ATU series on YouTube that goes a little more in-depth into those tale types and makes it a little more accessible. So if you're interested in like taxonomy of folk tales, I would recommend that series on YouTube. Next, I have the Foxfire book, which is like my holy grail for Appalachian and Southern folklore studies. The Foxfire series was born out of the Virginia WPA Writers Project in the early 30s, like right before the Great Depression, and it was kind of abandoned during the Great Depression, but these writers went all over Appalachia and interviewed a bunch of people trying to preserve and document old folk methods. So the Foxfire books, there's over like 10 editions of them now, but this is the first one, and some examples. It really captures folk life and folk ways and not just folk tales. So you'll see that material folklore. So here there's hog dressing, log cabin building, mountain crafts and foods, planting by the signs, snake lore, hunting tales, faith healing, and moonshining. And so each edition, each volume of the Foxfire series has different folk tales and folk ways and all of that, and that's super interesting. They really started the interest in Appalachian folklore in like the 60s and 70s. Hey! And something I also really love about it is it's all built around like interviews with real Appalachian people, and they preserve the way that they speak. So things are spelled really differently in here. Like instead of erasing and correcting the way that Appalachian people spoke, they embrace it and document it properly. So you'll see like here it says the top as TH apostrophe top, the of the A apostrophe TH apostrophe. And I just think that's so interesting because it is really important to preserve those kind of things that most people would look over, because something about folklore is that you really have to turn over every stone. You have to, I don't know. I love the Foxfire series. There's a Foxfire museum a couple hours away from me that I have been meaning to go to, and I am just so excited to go there soon. Next, I have a folklorist classic, which is The Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim. I actually have not read this yet. Bruno Bettelheim was one of the first people to apply psychoanalysis to folk tales and fairy tales specifically. He talks a lot about Little Red Riding Hood. He's a child psychologist, kind of talking about like how fairy tales educate and support children's learning and like how important they are. So I have not read this yet, but it is kind of a classic of the field, and I've been meaning to for a while. And if you're specifically interested in fairy tales, I would recommend The Uses of Enchantment. I have not read this yet, and I really need to. This is The Vanishing Hitchhiker by Jan Harold Brunvard, and this is all about American urban legends and what they mean and what they tell us about our society. And I'm really, really interested to read this, so hopefully I'll read that soon. Next, these three kind of go together. If you're specifically interested in Appalachian folklore, this is a really good place to start. Both of these are, all of these are really accessible. Backwoods Witchcraft, Conjure, and Folk Magic from Appalachia by Jake Richards, and Southern Cunning, Folkloric Witchcraft in the American South by Aaron Oberon. Both of these have come out in the past couple years, and these are two men that are witches giving their experience with their, you can see how many tabs I have in this one, growing up in the South and all of their family's traditions around witchcraft. And both of them talk about something that's really interesting in Appalachia, that a lot of times the word witch wasn't used, but all of these women are witches, to put it bluntly. Something I didn't really know until I read both of these books was how important religion is to Appalachian witchcraft. These women in early Appalachia are using the Bible as a spell book. They're faith healers. These granny women are using excerpts from the Bible for blood stopping. It is so, so, so interesting. I cannot recommend these two enough. They are both super accessible, and these were so good. I learned so much from these. And these kind of show you too, if you're interested, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute in the next part of the video, on how to integrate folklore into your life and how to keep folklore and folkways alive. These are great resources. And that also brings me to Wild Witchcraft by Rebecca Beyer, and she is writing out of the town that I'm living in. I live in Western North Carolina, and so this is another kind of manual of regional witchcraft. It's folk herbalism, garden magic, and foraging for spells, rituals, and remedies. So if you live around my area, this is going to be wonderful, because it is going to tell you regional herbs that you can harvest and grow and forage for, and different spells and what you can make with them, and different applications. Hi. So I would really recommend this book. I haven't finished it yet, but I have really enjoyed everything I've read from it so far. And then of course I have an edition of The Brothers Grimm. I really loved this illustration on the back. So those are kind of the books I have. A few that I would like to shout out that I don't have on me right now are Disfigured by Amanda LeDuc. That is also a super accessible way to get into what I was talking about with my interest and the intersection of disability and fairy tales. That's a super accessible way to get started on that. I also totally forgot about Signs, Cures, and Witchery by Gerald C. Milnes. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. And this is all about German Appalachian folklore. And there's accompanying documentary about this that you can just find on YouTube for free. And I really enjoyed both the book and the documentary. It gave me a lot of information while I was researching. And also does the same thing that Foxfire does, where it preserves the language of the people that they're interviewing. Also, The Silver Bullet, which of course I cannot remember the name of the author, but I'll put a picture up here. Unfortunately, that was an interlibrary loan, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I loved that book. I used it for most of my research for the abstract and the paper I was just telling you about. I do have a printed version of some of my favorite stories from it out here for research, but those are my book recommendations for you. I also wanted to tell you about a few podcasts that I would recommend, because I can't spend my whole day reading and researching as much as I would like to. So I have also been integrating folklore podcasts into my life, and that is so nice, because then I can research while I'm at the gym. I can research while I'm driving. And so I wanted to throw out Our Numinous Nature, wonderful podcast that I recently discovered. They have a whole episode on Appalachian witchcraft, and it was wonderful. It was like 2 hours long. it summarized, like, it was kind of annoying because I had done so much research at that point, and the guy that they were interviewing kind of was just saying all of the things that it had taken me so long to figure out, and I was like, this is awesome, but also, shit, I really just could have listened to this first. Also, the podcast Willing and Fable, where the hosts talk about a different folk or fairy tale every week, and then they write like their own version of it, which is really, really cool. Grim Reading, which is exactly what it sounds like. Two guys talking about fairy tales. And of course the Lore podcast, and that just tells you, that's more of like a folklore oriented podcast. So now I am turning it to you. This is how you can research folklore. If you are not living in Appalachia and you're not really interested in Appalachian folklore, I have some tips on how to learn more about your own regional folklore. So, you want to start with a region or an overarching subject that you're interested in. Your local area is a great place to start. Your bookstores or your libraries will have local interest sections, and you'll be able to find folklore resources within that. Also, check thrift stores. I've been able to find a lot of niche / like out of print folklore resources. Some of the ones I just showed you were from thrift stores. You have to keep your eye out. Something that you need to do as a folklorist is really keep your eye out for things. It can be exhausting, but leave no stone unturned. Like, you can find folklore anywhere. Anywhere can be a new resource. And then my favorite is interlibrary loans. As a college student, this is very easy for me. I don't know how easy it is at your local library. Sorry if the angle is slightly different. My phone just died, so I am back. Anyways, I was talking about interlibrary loans. I would have never gotten Silver Bullet, which became such an important resource to me, if I didn't look at interlibrary loans. I had heard about it in either Southern Cunning or Backwoods Witchcraft. One of those talked about it a lot, and I Googled it. I was like, I need this book. People were selling it for like $500 because it's been out of print for like 40 years. I looked through interlibrary loans and I got it immediately, and I had access to it for like 4 months. So if you're looking for a book and you just can't find it anywhere, interlibrary loans are your best friend. So those are kind of like my little tips and tricks. Those are a bunch of recommendations. I know this has been a really big video, so thank you so much if you've stuck around this long. I also wanted to talk about very briefly at the very end of this video how I integrate folklore into my life to try to keep these things alive. Obviously, I study it a lot, but like, what else do I do? I wanted to talk about herbalism. I work with a lot of the local herbs and native herbs around me. So I have a whole little tincture apothecary over there in a corner of my room of all of the herbs I've collected, and I use them every single day. I'm a weaver, so obviously that is a very traditional craft, especially in Appalachia, and so it feels like I get to connect a little bit with Appalachia when I weave, especially when I'm weaving really old patterns. I also participate in a lot of little folk superstitions and stuff like that. Over here, that little wooden bowl is a like money spell that I learned in one of these books, where that was something that Appalachian families would do. They would have a little bowl full of coins and some herbs sprinkled in there to encourage prosperity into their home. I pick up little things that I read in these books and I actually do them, and I actually apply it to my life. I'm moving off campus next semester and I am so excited. I'm gonna have like a horseshoe over the door to ward off bad energy. I'm gonna do all of those kind of things because integrating little parts of folklore into your life just makes your life more fun. As I said earlier, like, it kind of brings back that like childlike wonder. I just love it, and it makes me happier. I also lastly wanted to mention this tarot deck that I have called Tarot of the Divine. And it's inspired by deities, folklore, and fairy tales from around the world. And I use this a lot, and each time I use it, I learn about a new fairy tale. So I'll pull one right now, and we can learn about it. So it's a traditional tarot deck, but there are just different folk or fairy tales applied to each card. So this one, this is the Ace of Cups, so you can see. So now, I've actually pulled this one before, but let's look in the book and we can find out what it is. So this is based off the story of Matsuo Sake from Japan. It says, the Ace of Cups marks a new beginning, a reason to drink and be merry, and to open up to subconscious feelings. Sake is a drink of the gods, bringing people closer to the spirit world. And so you get to combine the meanings of the Ace of Cups and then also learn about a new folk or fairy tale. I love this tarot deck. I could not recommend it enough. It is just one of the many ways that I bring folklore into my daily life. So that is kind of everything I have for you guys today. Thank you so much if you stuck around to the end. I know this was a long video. I know I was trying to kind of cover a lot, so I hope I helped. I hope I answered some questions. Hope I gave you some good resources and some good ways to find your own. And thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I really appreciate you. Happy hunting. Good luck looking for folklore. If you need any help, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or you can message me on Instagram. My handle is just in the description box down below. I would love to talk to you about folklore. So that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.